Righteous Fire is one of the fastest League starters you can play, period. This is my character in a fresh SF hardcore run, 4.5 hours in, pushing yellow maps, and my damage is really good. And there's two main reasons this build is so fast as a League starter. Firstly, if you set up the way that I have, you have a ton of damage, as in more damage than I've had on any other build that I've playtested over the past week and a half, while retaining good defenses and good progression. Secondly, RF has a great playstyle, especially when you spec into a lot of area of effect nodes, and even though you move relatively slowly in terms of raw movement speed, the smooth clear actually makes a big difference in terms of how fast you can clear maps. If you want to see this run play out, how I do the build transitions and everything, I've linked the full Twitch VOD of this. I ended up dying in a T10 minus max map, so I didn't really get to finish this run, but it was roughly on pace to be about 6:30 to finish Eater and Exarch. I can't promise you this POB is going to be perfect, but I do know that it functions for what it's going to do. Fast as hell progression in the first 2 days of a league, with much better damage than I've seen anywhere else. So before I get into this POB, I am using a very specific fork. I've linked a folder in the description that you can actually use. If you replace the files within your POB folder with the files that I've linked, you can actually get access to this tree, but I'm sure local identity will have something up soon. So, it's not a Juggernaut, it's an Inquisitor. Why? It's basically so I can click Eldritch Battery with Mind Over Matter, a setup I'm really obsessed with right now just because it makes gearing so easy. When you're taking Eldritch Battery with Mind Over Matter, RF will degen both your life and ES, and Inquisitor can obviously recover both of these things at the same time with Pious Path. The obvious thing to note in this tree is that I've skipped the entire bottom left side. And yes, you give up a lot of max res, and yes, you give up a lot of armor. But instead of this, I'm able to get some really powerful nodes. Firstly, I'm able to go for a suppression cap on a build that usually isn't able to. This in mapping matters probably a little bit less, but does matter much more when you boss, especially if you want to do some of the easier uber bosses. The second big thing about this tree is that this area of the tree is really powerful offensively. Curses weren't nerfed this patch, so Whispers of Doom remains as one of the most powerful single nodes on the whole tree. Obviously, I also get EB over here, and then Snowforge is really great. I also go for Growth and Decay, a really powerful node for Righteous Fire, especially with this less damage taken over time in Mastery. But the way I'm able to do this though is by anointing Hardy. Early on, I actually path down to Hardy instead, but as you farm into your later parts of progression, you can unspec this and then go for a tree that goes towards Suppression, and then anointing this. And this will shore up your recovery to the point at which you feel pretty comfortable. There's actually not a lot to explain in a Righteous Fire build in my opinion, except for the progression, which I will go over in a bit. In general though, Righteous Fire is about making different decisions, and I think with this decision set, you have roughly enough defense to comfortably map in hardcore while having much more than enough damage. I mean, 3.3 million DPS, it might not seem like much, but I don't have any sort of like Awaken gems, and every single rare piece of gear that I have is actually not a real rare piece of gear. It's a 1 or 2 mod piece of gear with a bench mod. On one case, I have a multi-mod. So the gear is really weak. So let's go over that first. I'm using a +1 scepter with multi-mod fire damage, dot multi. The only other thing I'd want to hit on this would be something like +1 fire with generic dot multi and then multi-modding off of that. I'm using a +1 shield. Again, I just want to damage ES. There's a bunch of other options here. If you want to get easy suppression, the shield slot might be something to give up, especially early on before you can get down towards Magebane. Also something to note, if you're low on suppression, these nodes aren't out of the question for taking if you want to get capped. My helmet is just another piece where I'm looking for suppression, ES, Fizz's Fire, Flam Curse effect. And then my chest, I'm choosing to use a hybrid armor ES piece with no life, and the reason I'm using no life on my chest is because I'm actually taking the life mastery over here that gives you increased life if you have no life modifiers on your equipped body armor. In general though, the defensive modifiers increased hybrid is actually more powerful than life for most settings. And then I'm finishing this off with the benchcraft suppression. I think you probably will need to do this. I know a lot of people like to run the RF Elder helmet. Instead of that, I'm going for these gloves. So basically my goal would be to look for any sort of evasion base that has fracture suppression while I'm mapping, slam an Essence of Delirium on this, finish up with a benchcraft, maybe go for an Ashling 4 if I want to aim for +2, damage with flask effect or life. Legacy of Fury is relatively target farmable, and it's boost that I'd want. You don't actually need this. If you actually look at the VOD, I think this build clears fine without it, but obviously this makes it pretty much a T1 clear speed build in the early game. There are faster builds later, but this is really nice. My amulet is probably going to be an offensive slot. I'm not really sure. Other things to look for are dot multi, life, regen, max ES. Same thing with my rings, although to note, I do run one single unset ring because this build has a lot of socket pressure. In the unset, I'm actually using Wave of Conviction because I do probably want to opt for suppression on my gloves as the implicit. Finally, the belt I'm looking for is Immortal Flesh. Now, this isn't deterministic. Early on, I'd probably use something like a rare belt, prioritizing things like life regen, and the Betrayal mod for regenerating ES when there's a unique or rare enemy nearby. Pretty simple gear, nothing too special here. How do I get this kind of damage? It's basically because the skill setup when you go Inquis and EBM MoM is really powerful. Obviously, 6-link Fire Trap, we got the 4-link RF in the gloves. Over here, Shield Charge Defiance Banner. Here's where the damage starts coming in. Because I'm EB MoM, without using Maze Blood or Divergent Inspiration, I'm able to get an extra aura. In this case, I'm getting Malevolence. I'm able to fit this alongside Determ, Skitterbots, Vitality, and Discipline. Discipline in particular gives me a really big pool. Beyond the Wave Conviction in my ring, I'm also able to run 2 curses because of Whispers of Doom. So LE Weak is the second curse, and that gives you 23.4% more damage. And this is magnified further on really annoying mobs when you're mapping, so anything with increased fire res, this will benefit significantly on. I pretty much just identified some of the early game offensive affixes I might be looking for, but basically you're looking for things like res, regen, generic PDR, and there's a bunch of useful benchcrafts, but this is pretty much a clean template that you could work with. But obviously not quite as handholding as Pox's guide. Not even close. Actually, not close at all. But I want to talk a bit about progression. So obviously Templar progression now kind of sucks compared to what it used to be, especially since we lost both the Leap Slam attack suit from dual wielding scepters and the vendor recipe for flat damage. Things will be a little rougher, but I don't think it's any different. I still started by playing Rolling Magma, but this time I link it with Arcane Surge and LE Prolif instead of Onslaught, and I still do this sort of pathing over here. I want to grab Elemental Overload relatively early, but after that I'd actually go over towards Divine Judgment, because this 50% increased damage early in the game when you have very little increased damage modifiers is almost a more multiplier. As you're approaching level 28, you want to go for that Armageddon Brand Cremation setup. Some people have asked me if I could go for the Brand Recall setup. I wouldn't, because you really want to grab brand nodes to have good damage with that setup. Mine can't, so you just go for generic Armor Crema. So Armageddon Brand will be linked with Combustion, LE/Ignite Prolif, and then your Cremation, because of how Templar sockets work, gets linked with LE Focus, Cruelty probably, and Immolate as well. You can't really do the respec into Righteous Fire until you're done Cruel Lab. In the run that I did, I actually got these nodes, and I needed to get Hardy over here and also the Max Life from Barbarism. But now you'll be able to get this Recovery Mastery, which gives you 50 life regen per second. Pop this on, pop on Vitality, make sure you're res capped. Maybe grab Sanctity as well, and you should be able to pretty comfortably run Righteous Fire. The big thing to know about this run in particular is that I would really push Act 6 before I go back, because I don't like doing Library. I go for Act 6 around level 39 instead of farming Chamber of Innocence, and then I can buy my Fire Trap there, so I have a leveled up Fire Trap when I want to do the swap at around level 50. If you don't do that, things will be really painful. Other things to note, I really prioritize getting AoE nodes right away. And when you do go for the RF respec, you actually want to drop EO, because this doesn't apply to RF at all, and it only applies partially to Fire Trap, but not really, because you don't throw that many traps anyway. Instead, I'd probably start pathing over here and slowly making my way up towards EB MoM. I think because of how strong Righteous Fire and Fire Trap are in the early game, it's possible to get straight to Blood Aqueducts, and I would farm Blood Aqueducts all the way until I'm pretty comfortably running both Eldritch Battery and Mind Over Matter. And I'd probably actually rush these aura nodes so you can grab all of your auras, so Discipline, Determination, Skitterbots, Vitality. All of these things are really great, and then you can also run your Divine Blessing Malevolence. If you find yourself socket pressured, you might not want to go for this early, but honestly this sort of tree is nice too, because it shores up some of your dexterity requirements early on, letting you run a higher level faster attacks with that shield charge. That's pretty much all I've got to say about this build. If you want to know how to really get this build going though, and see how every step really happens, I'd highly encourage you to watch the VOD. It's going to be fairly similar to what you could do in patch 3.21, except it'll be even easier to run in patch 3.21 because you do have that 50 flat regen early on. Otherwise, if you really need handholding, you know where to go. And it sure as hell is not here. Good luck on League Start.